And so I'm going to introduce Professor Alessandro Malantrucco, and then he's going to do an introduction, and then I'm going to read his paper. And then he's going to do some translation for me on some of the words that are in Greek. And then he's also has the slides. So Professor Alessandro Malantrucco, born and residing in Rome, Italy, holds a baccalaureate in philosophy and theology, along with a licentiate and doctorate in spiritual theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University. Since 1994, he has taught Catholic religion, currently at Liceo Scientifico Statale Vito Volterra in Ciampino. Thank you. Engaged in Shroud research since 1979. He collaborated with his father, Dr. Luigi Malantrucco, on physical causes of Jesus' death based on the Gospels and the Shroud. Professor Malantrucco spoke at conferences in Orvieto in 2000 and in Paris in 2002, and contributed to a study in Dallas in 2005, and has published multiple theological studies on the Shroud. Professor, welcome.
Okay.
Thank you. Good to have you.
Thank you. I extend cordial greetings to those present and thank the organizer of this conference for providing me with a second space to present my work. In this talk, I present two different through linked contributions, starting from my research on the experience of Jesus' death according to the Gospel and the Shroud. In the first part, I explain the theoretical basis of my research, with methodological and epistemological issues that I believe are also essential in the Shroud study. In the second part, I present the project of developing an app dedicated to browsing through the main scientific, historical, and biblical studies concerning the Shroud, to expand visibility and accessibility to known and researched data. I begin with the methodological and epistemological framework underlying my doctoral research on Jesus' physical, psychological, and spiritual experience facing his own death.
Thank you. So my field is spiritual theology, which is the investigation outlook in which this research moves. Spiritual theology studies spirituality, that is the religious experience lived by individuals and human communities. It is essential to avoid a disembodied and unreal understanding of this experience, which is always lived in a physical body. The term theology stands for a reasonable thought about the human relationship with the divine. This theological specialization does not pursue dogmatic or apologetic interests, but rather experiential ones. And this is precisely my approach in studying Jesus' death, how he behaved before it as a man in relationship with God. Moreover, since in the 4th century AD, the Church solemnly affirmed in the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople that Jesus was crucified for us. This research aims to understand the meaning of this expression in Christian religious experience, and also as a possibility that interests those who are not Christians from a non-dogmatic but spiritual, experiential viewpoint. Opening the Second Vatican Council, Pope John Paul XXIII made an extraordinary statement able of deeply marking the path of Christian life. The gospel doesn't change, but we begin to understand it better. I grew up and was educated in this church. By time, by life experience, including spiritual experience, and by studying, I understood that the key passage in this message, in my opinion, as revolutionary, is we begin. Teachers like St. Gregory of Nyssa and Brother Roger of Taizé confirm the need to continuously begin again throughout the course of our lives, the spiritual path. These leanings of the Christian life originate in the gospel. when Jesus meets Nicodemus, a man whose faith is already widely and deeply developed, he reveals to him the need for a second spiritual birth in order to pursue the path to God. And when the teacher begins his public activity by announcing the coming of the kingdom of God, he calls for a conversion in faith that is realized in a very peculiar form. The Greek verb used by Mark and Matthew,
metanoeite,
in fact, indicates the action of a radical change in one's way of thinking, and not only a religious and ethical conversion. It is critically essential to always be willing to begin again, understanding the reality in a new way, courageously making the decision to change one's ways of thinking and viewpoints. In my professional work as a Catholic religion teacher in state high schools in Italy, outside of ecclesiastical environments, in touch and confronting students, families, and colleagues from the most different approaches regarding the religious phenomenon in its manifold manifestations, an exchange of ideas between Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini and agnostic and philosopher Norberto Bobbio is a reference for me. They agreed that in confronting fundamental issues for human life, the true difference is not between believers and non-believers, but between those who think and those who do not. That is, between those who ponder the various wise and indifferent and the indifferent that do not ponder. Unfortunately, the species of the indifferent is by far the most numerous, both among believers and non-believers. This is true, in my opinion, even about the Shroud. It is extremely important to raise the level of intellectual and cultural thinking with respect to it. In researching the experience of Jesus' death through the Gospels and the Shroud, I pursued a form of unity of knowledge using a complex epistemological vision, a transdisciplinary approach, and a synoptic method. I am going to explain in detail the various components of this research framework. By synoptic method, I mean the parallel analysis of the 5 key documents that I have used as sources for studying the experience of Jesus' death, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, particularly in the chapters focusing on Jesus' passion, death, and burial, and the Shroud. All contain relevant data in this research. By placing them side by side, these data are compared carefully, avoiding forcing interpretations, highlighting both correspondences and discordances, and analyzing the causes of the latter to check for their possible explanations. From a medical perspective, which is the starting point of this investigation, the Gospel accounts provide an anamnestic report about the suffering and physical pathologies suffered by Jesus during his agony. The Shroud, on the other hand, constitutes a physical and visual record of this, allowing for a diagnosis. My research process is marked by a sequence of steps that I constantly try to keep in mind, just as I learned to do under the supervision of the moderator of my doctoral dissertation in the Institute of Spirituality at the Pontifical Gregorian University, Professor Don Fabrizio Pieri. He was a biblical scholar and physician. And also in my long-term studying experience in the field of Christian spirituality through the Gospels, the Bible, and the Shroud. I would like to focus your attention to some passages that seem to me most needed in the community of scholars, both in the biblical and in the historical scientific fields. The debate between the scholars, more often than not, seems unwilling to accept a joint verification regarding the results achieved in a perspective that is not exclusively sectorial, but transdisciplinary. Stances not infrequently emerge that manifest a mutual lack of trust and esteem, and sometimes even a lack of balance and respect in expressing thoughts regarding scholars who present ideas different from one's own. This happens especially about the Shroud, between the two opposing sides of authenticists and deniers, among whom many tend to force the data and their interpretations to support their own theses, but also by some reductionists who, in the uncertainty of a current solution to the question of the shroud's authenticity, choose to consider it an icon of Jesus' passion and death anyway, whatever its origin. And also among those who implement an absolute suspension of judgment on it. There seems to be a lack of willingness for sincerely shared and non-hostile research, free from partisan interests and mutual suspicions, which also accepts the chance for review of the findings when not verified by multiple different perspectives. In the epistemological and methodological framework of my research, I have taken as reference two criteria reproposed by the latest Pope Francis's magisterium. These are principles related to bipolar tensions, which constitute fundamental parameters in the Catholic Church's teachings to interpret and evaluate many and various phenomena. The first criterion states that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It is the totality criterion, the experience of Jesus' death, the Gospels, the Holy Scriptures, and the Shroud. They must be understood in their wholeness as a totality, and the individual parts that constitute the whole of this articulate and complex working must be understood in a complementary form, not separately and independently one from another. The second criterion states that reality is superior to the idea. It is the reality criterion. Our ideas about reality cannot be separated from it. They serve it as a function of seizing it, understanding it, and directing it, so that it may be illuminated by reasoning. We could make reference to two main approaches to the knowledge of reality. The simplicity epistemology is the one most widely used in the centuries-old tradition of Western thought, including Christian thought. The package consists of very important researches such as Aristotelian logic and Euclidean geometry, with a linear and sequential form of thinking and cause and effect deduction processes. Looking for simple explanations as directly as possible is a very functional ancient habit of mind, but under given conditions. Occam's razor, for instance, is a valid methodological principle, but a simpler explanation can be preferred to a more complex one, only if the factors between the two are equal. To search for simplicity, one cannot always simplify everything and anything. The danger is reductionism. The tendency of this way of thinking is to dualism, that is, the dividing into two of reality, which through the mental mechanism of out, zero,
Latin.
Out, leads to exclusivism. Sometimes this rational process is effective and functional, but not in all situations. Extremizing disciplinary specializations over the centuries has heavily accentuated this process, isolating the parts of the knowledge of reality which are no longer communicating one with another. Complexity epistemology has developed more recently, starting in the 20th century, with the crisis of the previous model caused by various discoveries, including relativity, quantum mechanics, and chaos theory. Complex logic is not linear and sequential. It is less rigid and more dynamic. It encourages systemic thinking. The search for understanding reality takes place according to a polyhedral model, which is less uniform and homogeneous than the previous one. This form of thinking tends toward holism and exclusiveness. Inclusiveness, thank you. This form of thinking tends toward holism and inclusiveness, favoring et over out. Recognizing the complexity of reality must be careful not to lead to the complication of its management. In this model, complementarity between the parts of the whole is pursued, and thus a unified view of knowledge through transdisciplinary correlation between all its fields. We have available to us, therefore, two different major systems of thinking.
Metanoeite,
which means to change the way of thinking, means in this regard to decide which of the two we choose to use, depending upon the research conditions. to distinguish and discern when it is most needed to separate, select, and exclude the parts of the whole in the process of knowing and understanding, and when instead to unite and compose them while avoiding reductionism or maximalism. It is a pragmatic, non-ideological procedure ordered to be to the prevailing of reality over ideas, with the latter serving the former for the understanding of the whole and its parts. Pope Francis also recommended a most urgent, fundamental... did I miss something? Sorry about that.
In my research.
Thank you. In my research work, I mainly choose this complex epistemological model following the Magisterium by Pope Francis. Here our model is not the sphere, which is not greater than its parts, where every point is equidistant from the center, and there are no differences between them. Instead, it is the polyhedron which reflects the convergence of all its parts, each of which preserves its distinctiveness." Unquote. Pope Francis also recommended a most urgent, fundamental, and enduring criterion in renewing and revitalizing theological studies in the Catholic Church during the contemporary epistemological evolution. The contemplation and the presentation of a spiritual, intellectual, and existential introduction into the heart of the kerygma, the fundamental core of the gospel of Jesus. This represents for a Catholic Christian researcher like me the compass needle that points the direction and helps keep one on the course in understanding such a complex reality as Jesus' experience facing his agony and death, and the documents that witness to it, the Gospels and the Shroud. So, during my research, I tried to move from a simpler, linear, and sequential, but potentially divided conceptualization into separate sections, as I was previously accustomed, to a more complex and systemic one, looking for an enhanced complementarity between the parts of the whole. So here is how I developed two consecutive mind maps according to the two different epistemologies, a simple first and a complex second. I apologize to you for not being able to re-elaborate them in English. Essential to the methodological framework of my research is the selection of tools for studying biblical texts. In 1993, the Pontifical Biblical Commission elaborated an outstanding review of methods and approaches useful for the interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, which was approved by Pope John Paul II. The paper explains, quote, "By an exegetical method, we understand a group of scientific procedures employed in order to explain texts. We speak of an approach when it is a question of an inquiry proceeding from a particular point of view." Unquote. All known methods and approaches are analyzed thoroughly and evaluated regarding both the positive contribution they can make to biblical studies and their limitations. The only rejected interpretation is the fundamentalist one, which interprets the Bible literally in all its details. For the Catholic Church, this is an unbiblical ideology, since it demands an unshakable adherence to rigid doctrinal points of view and imposes, as the only source of teaching for Christian life and salvation, a reading of the Bible which rejects all questioning and any kind of critical research. It refutes to take into account the historical character of biblical revelation, and it makes itself incapable of accepting the full truth of incarnation itself. The Pontifical Biblical Commission delivers a categorically adverse assessment of it. Without saying as much in so many words, fundamentalism actually invites people to a kind of intellectual suicide. This is Paul's same thought in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6 regarding the new covenant. The letter brings death, but the Spirit brings life. A reliable biblical study that aims to be scientific cannot disregard the use of the historical critical method. I have therefore chosen to use it as a basis of my research on the Gospels and other New and Old Testament texts. It enables us to understand them analytically, almost disassembling them in all their components. The languages with their rules, the semantics, the drafting layers, and the literary forms present. In this way, it highlights a diachronic form on the meaning expressed by the authors and writers. However, to put together the pieces of the biblical puzzle once disassembled into its parts and access the overall meaning of the text, it requires to work along with other methods and approaches. Referring to the objectives of my research, I opted for two approaches. Among those that refer to the human sciences, I have chosen psychological and psychoanalytic approaches to biblical texts, which can thus be understood as life experiences. The Pontifical Biblical Commission observes how religion is always in a situation of conflict or debate with the unconscious. In this research, the focus is in understanding Jesus' deep experience of his own agony and death. In order to work on overall understanding of the spiritual meaning of such an experience in light of the links between the texts of the Gospels, the New and the Old Testament, I then chose the canonical approach, the principal one among those based on the tradition of the Christian faith. It interprets each biblical text in light of the canon of Holy Scripture. It follows, therefore, the same exegetical and hermeneutical process that Jesus realized with his disciples according to the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. In presenting this research, I have already mentioned the importance, functionality, and effectiveness of a transdisciplinary approach to complex issues, particularly to the study of both documents such as the Shroud and the Gospels and the topic of this paper. In Pope Francis's guidelines, the unity of knowledge, quote, in difference and respect for its multiple correlated and convergent expressions, qualifies on the level of both content and method, unquote. The renewal of the system of ecclesiastical studies. In this perspective, transdisciplinarity is to be pursued, which represents the strong form of interdisciplinarity, the weak form of which, on the other hand, is that of multidisciplinary system. In this one, the different disciplines of study flank each other without directly interacting, remaining separate and sectorial. In the medium form, on the other hand, they cooperate each other in relation to the same goals, converging more but not fully integrating. In the strong form, they even become complementary and condition each other, modifying processes and outcomes of their respective researches, thus enabling them to achieve a more comprehensive vision of reality. When science and historical studies cross with religious issues, it is useful to discern their respective areas of expertise. Just 4 years after the scientific discovery of the Shroud by the first photograph in 1898, an agnostic scientist like Yves Delage was already suggesting this idea in a heated debate with the Paris Academy of Sciences. In the same year, 1902, in another field of study, the psychology of religion, Theodore Flournoy affirmed a similar principle, so-called of exclusion of transcendentance. The sciences must refrain from any judgment about the objective meaning of religious phenomena, excluding within themselves any discussions related to supernatural realities. Of course, such a condition is reciprocal between the sciences and religion. It, too, must respect at an appropriate distance the specific competencies of those. Now, leaning on Catholic philosopher and apologist Jean Guiton, I will present a complementary reasoning to the two contributions of Delage and Flournoy. I imagine it might destabilize and bother some people who, like me, are believers, but I will try to explain it as best I can. For those who are not familiar with the figure of Guiton, an influential 20th century thinker, he is the first layperson called as an observer by Pope John XXIII to the Second Vatican Council. I personally agree with his idea that shroud analysis cannot offer us any proof of Jesus' divinity. This is because reasonably divinity cannot be demonstrated by any fact, no matter how extraordinary. but human reasoning to belief can only consist on this person's own testimony about his intimate self. Faith in Christ is based on the testimony he gives about himself, on his word, which sheds light on his signs and the miracles. This centuries-old misunderstanding originated with the transition in the first centuries of Christianity from the Semitic culture of the Holy Scripture to the Hellenistic culture, already expressed by the dogmas promulgated by the councils and by the theology of church fathers, and becoming prevailing for centuries with Thomistic and scholasticism. The rational and philosophical conceptualization of divine revelation produced a very important shift in terminology and meaning in this direction. Throughout the Bible, in fact, the concept of proof, as we now usually understand it, that is, as a persuasive rational demonstration for something, is completely missing. The Gospels refer to signs performed by Jesus as a manifestation of his divinity, never to proofs. The difference is crucial. Proofs provide unquestionable certainty, while signs require interpretation, and they can be interpreted in many different ways, so they leave around them a range of uncertainty. This is the reason why, in order to accept them as a divine revelation, an act of faith is required. These arguments, as applied to the Shroud, make it possible to discern two levels of study regarding it, according to the principle of the distinction of transcendence. A first basic level limited to the survey, description and analysis of the Shroud data at the historical and scientific level. Here the Gospels and all biblical texts can be used as historical records, but not at a religious level. At this level, certain transcendent elements cannot be considered. Any religious value of the object of study, appealing to miraculous or supernatural in order to explain scientifically or historically unknown phenomena, comparing with mystical experiences, Eucharistic miracles, and the resurrection hypothesis as cause of the formation of the body image in the Shroud. And a second higher level where it is possible and legitimate to perform interpretations of transcendent religious meanings, especially through theological reasoning, even in relation to phenomena that are considered supernatural. A right religious use of the Shroud by the Catholic Church, which holds ownership of it in the person of the pontiff and custody of it by means of the Archbishop of Turin, requires legitimizing itself by answering a simple twofold question, which sets the requirements for both its conservation in the Cathedral of Turin and its offering to the devotion and worship of the believers. What is the Shroud and what is it not? Current Catholic Church regulation requires relics to be used moderately and ordinately. They must be certified and guaranteed as authentic by ecclesiastical authorities. Otherwise, they may not be kept in places of worship or displayed for veneration. Indeed, the Catholic Church has legislation and procedures for recognizing the relic's authenticity. We know, on the other hand, that the case of the Shroud was seriously complicated and hampered by radiocarbon dating in 1988, which for 30 years caused an impasse, if not a retreat, of official positions about its authenticity as a relic. Today, the situation should be able to get moving again because the unreliability of those tests has been revealed, but there are still no clear signals to this effect. The Catholic Church could also have a second possibility for studying the Shroud, applying to it the regulations and procedures in cases of recognizing miracles to the causes of saints and to the Lord's sanctuary in France, where a special medical bureau works using meticulous methods. But even here, no one has yet thought of or suggested such a possibility. Now I introduce some main issues concerning the sources of my research about Jesus' death experience, the Gospels and the Shroud. The Gospels are the first of these sources by relevance, although not chronologically because they were written years after the finding of the Shroud in the sepulchre and its initial preservation, which is still unknown in its modalities. The research about the historical Jesus has its influence in this investigation. It has gone through various phases from the 18th century to the present day, swinging at first between the two polarities represented by the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, and then settling even at present on the Jewishness of his figure, work and message in the historical religious background in the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Research in this field is continuing. Although the canonical Gospels are neither a biography of Jesus nor neutral accounts of him, and although they have evidence of errors and potential inconsistencies when narrating some events, I am personally convinced about their essential historic reliability. This is not because of reasons of faith or the need to support it, because of in-depth critical studies by many, many scholars, and also by a principle as simple as it is fundamental, formulated by Jean Guiton, the logic of testimony. It is the historical testimony of the apostles that generates faith as its consequence, and not vice versa, faith artificially originating historical testimony by twisting or falsifying it for its own interests. The typical case of the wound in the side, which I reported at the end of my first talk at this conference, is a clear illustration of this observation. The literary excavation effort on these texts using bilingual Greek-Aramaic philology enables us to reach the originating Semitic layer of their drafting, conceived and also presumably elaborated in the evangelist's own language, which was not the Greek of the texts we have received, but Aramaic in Galilean variant for common speech, along with Hebrew for liturgy and sacred texts. This unravels many ostensible obtrusiveness in the texts as they are in their Greek version. To take an example pertaining to the shroud, the word
Otonia,
as used in John 19:40 to indicate the cloths in which the Jesus body was wrapped in the sepulchre, is a plural in Greek, but its Aramaic equivalent is a dual, which can be translated as double cloth, precisely describing the shroud put under and over the Jesus' body in his deposition. Some scholars conjecture the possible existence of an early narrative block for the Gospels composed solely by the Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection events, the so-called proto-gospel of the cross. Further narrative blocks would follow: miracles, parables, nativity, etc. This is an interesting idea which, even if not sufficiently supported by literary and historical evidence, makes one consider the possibility of a progressive drafting of the Gospels, whose final non-original version we have received, only resulting from the comparison of several copies rewritten by
amanuensis
of over several centuries, having recognized drafting variants an object of extensive and detailed studies. It must be considered that the exclusively manual writing processes of that time were very complex, slow, and expensive. To write the Torah, a scribe could take about a year's work, needing about 62 animal skins sewn together, with a cost corresponding to today's tens of thousands of euros or dollars, having a much higher value in ancient times. In relation to the focus of this research, namely Jesus' human and spiritual experience of his own agony and death, reference to his non-verbal communication is latent in the writings of the Gospels. Indeed, instead, it represents a quantitatively and qualitatively prevailing component over the more attentively focused verbal communication. This element, together with those I have just indicated, suggests a wide margin of knowledge that is still missing and deserves further research in this field. The last absolutely fundamental emphasis about the Gospels as a source concerns the numerous and remarkable correspondences between them and the shroud, in the textual and visual description of the sufferings experienced by Jesus as he faced his own death on the cross. Now I come to the other fundamental source of this research, the shroud, the focus in this conference. The starting point for its possible use as a document and material witness to the burial, and thus also to the passion and death of Jesus, is the answer to the same simple double question regarding the possible religious use of it. What is the shroud and what is it not? It is not a human artifact, not with respect to its textile workmanship, but with respect to the physiological traces and imprint of a man's body on the cloth, as was scientifically established by the Stirp investigations in 1978, the longest running and most thorough study campaign performed directly on the shroud ever to date. At its first level of study, as previously indicated, the shroud is foremost and very merely a material object, textile type, which has various identifiable traces on it. As a whole, and at this first level, on the historical level, it is a document, a testimony, and a source for study. At the second level of study, the shroud is traditionally considered a relic, the most sacred in Christianity. But the Catholic Church has not yet officially pronounced about its authenticity, although its practice regarding it is an implicit and indirect endorsement. In an interpretive perspective, more in accordance with the content and meaning of the gospel accounts, the shroud is a sign which must be interpreted even in a context of faith. At the second level, two terms used to say what the shroud is are, in my opinion, misleading: akiropite and icon. Akiropite means a sacred image not made by human hand, but miraculously appeared or formed by a supernatural intervention of divine origin. Theoretically, this definition could attach to the shroud as far as the body print on the cloth, since its origin has not yet been scientifically explained. But both the physical and chemical features of this print and the biological traces on the cloth are scientifically outlined, and the latter have a clear, not miraculous, but natural explanation. The term akiropite is therefore ambiguous in relation to the shroud, not least because it compares it to other sacred images that are believed to be akiropite, eluding the absolutely unique and original specific characteristics of the shroud itself. The second term often used to say what the shroud is, which is also ambiguous and misleading, is icon. An icon is a sacred image painted by a human artist. The shroud is not that. Only metaphorically and very remotely can the image of the body on the shroud be referred to as an icon, never absolutely in the proper sense. A second step required in order to use the shroud as a document of Jesus' death and burial is to answer another question. Did the shroud really wrap the body of a dead man? As I showed in my first talk at this conference, the medical diagnostic answer to this question is certainly yes. The body posture is that of an instantaneous rigidity due to cadaveric spasm. The traces of blood are distinguishable between vital and post-mortem. This second type is especially detectable in the stain of blood spilled from the wound in the side and dripped under it, up to behind the man's lower back. This blood is decomposed due to the loss of blood circulation following death. The wound in the side did not heal due to the missing vital processes in an already deceased man. It is necessary at this step to ask a third and crucial question: whose body was wrapped in the shroud? Possible answers to this question are three. An unknown crucified, a man casually tortured and crucified in the same way as Jesus. The dating of such a possibility must predate the 5th century, when crucifixion fell into disuse as a method of death by execution. Detectable traces in the shroud, such as those of the crowning with thorns and the wound in the sides, elements known only in the case of Jesus' death and condemnation, make this hypothesis extremely unlikely. A poor Christ, number 2, a poor Christ, an unfortunate person chosen to be tortured in the same way as Jesus. Such a possibility might be located after the 1st century, but even more so after the 4th century, at the end of the persecutions for Christians, and before the 14th century when the Shroud certainly arrived in France. Medical diagnostic analyses on it detect traces that are understandable only from the 17th century onward. The chances of an artificially obtaining them by coincidence are practically zero. In these two scenarios, the Catholic Church would preserve in a place of worship and expose to the faithful's veneration a fake relic, merely erroneous in the first case, tragically unholy, though with intentions for pious fraud in the second. Option 3, the shroud wrapped the body of Jesus of Nazareth after his death on the cross and during his burial. The comparison between the Gospels and the shroud about Jesus' passion, death, and burial is absolutely crucial. What would we understand about the shroud without the Gospels? Has anyone ever seriously tried to think about it? The Shroud of Turin is the original burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth. This is the absolutely most grounded and plausible hypothesis, especially because of historically and scientifically ascertainable correspondences between the data on it and the Gospel accounts of Jesus' passion and death. Alternative hypotheses show a plausibility and probability degree of less than 0.x%. Of course, there remain open questions to be resolved. Among the main ones, dating cloth, image formation, history of the shroud before 1353. But identifying the body of a dead man wrapped in the shroud is a priority issue and absolutely superior in importance to them.
We can skip next slide.
Okay. And then where would you like me to go? All right, the data project here?
Yes.
Okay. Based on my experience in researching Jesus' death experience, I have been thinking about a useful tool that would make easily accessible to both the community of scholars and the more simply interested people the main scientific, historical, and biblical studies regarding the shroud, which are certainly less known than those on the Gospels. In the school year that just ended, I was able to work with a small group of students in the Scientific State High School Vito Volterra in Ciampino, where I have been teaching Catholic religion since 2004 and also civic education since 2020, at an experimental project entitled Turin Shroud Data Project, aiming to create an app that would make available research and access to studies concerning the shroud in different fields of investigation. The goals of this project are cultural, didactic, and educational, not religious.
Next slide.
Okay. As working basis for this project, I chose the paper proposed by the Shroud Science Group on Yahoo at the 3rd Dallas International Conference on the Shroud of Turin in 2005. The paper was signed by 24 researchers in the group, including myself. It was coordinated by Professor Giulio Fanti and included several leading figures in the field of shroud studies, as well as dear Barry Schwartz. I chose this paper as a starting point for developing an app to manage shroud studies because it displays a very interesting and, in my opinion, still applicable conceptual framework that deserves to be taken up and further worked on. I refer to cataloging the list of facts and observations regarding the shroud into 4 categories, which are organized on the basis of the different types of evidence. A, unquestionable observations on the shroud. B, confirmed observations or conclusions based on a proof made in reference to shroud studies. C, facts or observations evidenced by some researchers but not universally accepted. And D, correspondences with facts described in the Holy Scripture. One of the most evident merits in this proposal is its cooperative format and large collegiality.
Next.
Okay. Student developers have set up a Shroud visual app leaning on the web. It will be available in 2 languages, Italian and English. From the home page, one can access to the map or log in as admin to manage the internal data in it. The dashboard admin enables student researchers and operators to add evidences one by one and display them in a list from which they can both be edited and deleted. By creating or editing evidences, each is titled, coded, and described, also being able to add and connect media and links. Users who access the app are shown an interactive map of evidences, that is, data that help to understand and analyze various phenomena pertaining to the Shroud, organized according to the 4 categories from the paper of the Shroud Science Group on Yahoo and Dallas 2005. Each evidence may be accessed by clicking on its code corresponding to those in the same paper. Thus, for example, clicking on item A1 opens the tab for the first identified chemical, physical characteristic of the linen yarns and fibers. The yarn used to weave the shroud was spun with a Z twist. The lower part of the window lists historical, scientific, or biblical studies related to this feature. Forthcoming, we will connect them via links to the papers that are available online.
I can conclude.
Okay, very good.
Okay. I'm currently working to develop the pilot project into a didactic educational one to be approved by the Teachers College of Scientific State High School Vito Volterra in Ciampino in the 3-year plan for educational offerings as a pathways for transversal skills and orientation. With students in the final 3 years of the course will be able to choose in their curriculum among the 90 hours required by law. I am now working with contacts with Ateneo Pontificio Regina Apostolorum and the Shroud of Turin Research and Education Association. This evening we have a meeting to cooperate for this project. We are waiting for develop the app in the next year. Thank you for attention. If you are interested, these are my contact, and next time I will open a website about this question.
Any questions or thoughts? Yes, Tristan. Yeah, we need a mic. Maybe you're up.
Thank you very much. I mean, Alessandro, for your presentation. It is really interesting. I mean, and to see also how depth you could go. I mean, in these theological and historical perspectives. I would like to, you know, in my articles, I have often emphasized that it is possible to have historical evidence in favor of the resurrection, also through the Turin Shroud. And I would like to know, I mean, what is your position about that? Because I understand that according to you, there is no possible proof. We can have no certainty about the cause of the image formation process. And
cosa penso io della formazione?
Sì,
What I think about the image for
no,
the
yes.
image formation.
Is it conceivable that we can have evidence? And how it is related also,
evidence for resurrection?
Yeah. And how it is related
It is a big
also.
question.
No,
I thank you for the question.
Yeah. And how it is related also to the...
You know that yesterday evening we talked about this, and I am developing my opinion in this. And this meeting is very useful for this, because normally I work alone.
And I think that maybe also...
It is difficult to develop a ragionamento, a reasoning. Only mind,
And,
one
You know,
So I am open to other possibilities, but now I have not evidence for this question.
you should have maybe also maybe take a look at the First Vatican Council, and not only focus on the second, because in the First Vatican Council with Dei Filius, there was a dogmatic definition that we can have, human beings can have access can prove the existence of God through reason only.
Esseri umani possiamo dimostrare l'esistenza di Dio come esseri umani.
Oh,
it is a dogmatic.
yes, it is.
It's based on
It is a
Aquinas.
useful input for me. I will read your quotation, and then I apply my mind to this idea. Actually, I am not able to reason for it.
Maybe one more quick question, or we're pretty close to having to break.
Did Tristan say that the First Vatican Council said that we can
Ha detto che il primo Vaticano faceva la cosa?
Primo.
Primo, no, il secondo. Aspettavano la recensione.
Okay, well, thank you, Alessandro. Thank you so much.
Thank you.